Beating a Dead Horse, where we talk about who died, who lives, and who deserved to die. I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And today we're going to be talking about the 2016 movie Captain America: Civil War. Now, a lot of people really like this movie, myself including, especially during the first time. I thought it was a lot of fun and really excellent, but there are definitely some people who aren't as thrilled with it. Jackson!
I wonder who that could be. Why don't you before we dive into the business of opinions, why don't you give us a quick little summary for the, 3 people in the world who haven't seen this movie or forgot what it was?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Captain America: Civil War is basically the story of the falling out between Captain America and Iron Man as they fight over the custody of their child, Bucky Barnes. Yeah, that is basically what it is it's the ugly divorce of the Avengers. Without getting too much into the spoilers, it's how they split apart.
Well said. So, do you want to give your general thoughts on the movie first? Because mine, I know that it seems like, from what you made it sound like I totally, hate this movie. I have very complicated thoughts about this movie. Very conflicting thoughts sometimes. So I want to hear your take on it first.
Yeah, as I said, I really liked it for my first watch through. And my second watch through honestly didn't do much to diminish that. I thought it was a genuinely enjoyable movie. I thought the plot, especially in the beginning, was really, really good. It did start to feel a little bit more contrived towards the end, and as I was watching it the second time, I started to think about it in a little bit of a different way of, this is kind of ridiculous as far as the plan and everything. But overall, I thought it was rather enjoyable, and especially given the source material being a sprawling comic series, they did a really nice job with reimagining Civil War, but still managing to capture the heart of Civil War. I do think there are parts of it that are very different from the rest of the movie. The big fight scene in the middle of it feels really out of place, but that doesn't make it a bad fight scene is the thing. It was a very well done movie, well shot, very enjoyable, just kind of a hodgepodge of things that don't always work together.
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of similar thoughts that I have, because when I think about my opinions on this movie, it's sort of hard to divorce them kind of from my thoughts about the MCU in general, right? This is the big blockbuster franchise that dominates the way we make blockbuster movies, the way we view them, the way we talk about them. The MCU has changed the game in a lot of ways. And
the way we create dark universes for the Mummy to exist within.
Oh man, you want to talk about failed universes? They make the beginning of the DC universe look like a resounding success. Just
it's they had plans for the DC universe, and this was hey, we got a bunch of old properties, let's put them together.
What if we brought the Wolfman back from the 30s, the Wolfman? Anyway, so it's sort of hard to divorce my I think divorce thoughts in this movie from thoughts on the Marvel movies in general, and I think overall the Marvel movies are good, but maybe a little oversaturated. Generally, you can expect a baseline amount of quality, just in terms of, the writing, the filmmaking. You can expect these movies to be good, to entertain you for 2 hours.
You will never leave feeling bad about what you just saw.
Yeah, it's not like a Transformers movie where, you feel you've been violated in some way. Your eyes, start to bleed. No. That'll never happen with a Marvel movie. But I think generally with them, there's kind of 2 tiers. The ones that are sort of feel like they were made on a factory line, a conveyor belt, that have hit all the same beats. Doctor Strange was like this.
Oh yeah.
Thor 1. The movies that you watch and you're oh, that was fun, but you never think about it again, except to talk about kind of the generic Marvel tone I like to think of. But then I think there are a few movies in the canon that really stand out for one reason or another, just in terms of it had maybe a bit more of a vision behind it, more interesting stuff going on, for good or ill.
Characters that just exist unto themselves as impressive, enjoyable characters. I mean,
Yeah.
Guardians of the Galaxy is the perfect example of that one. I mean, I will never not sing the praises of that first Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah, Guardians 1, you can feel that one was a big one. I think is in this category. I know this is an unpopular opinion. I would throw my weight behind Iron Man 3 as sort of being elevated. Winter Soldier, I don't really like that movie, but it's definitely not like the rest of the Marvel movies. It's got more going on behind it.
No matter your opinion on that one, it's definitely not Thor 1.
It's definitely not Thor: The Dark World. No, so that sort of brings me, and I would very much consider Civil War in this category, in that, especially I think the filmmaking, like you said, I think is actually a real cut above from most of the other Marvel movies, just in terms of the way the action is staged, the way it's shot. I think the tone is handled a lot better, because while I love, like, Guardians 1, when I saw Guardians 2 recently, I thought that they had a harder time reconciling the more dramatic stuff with the funny stuff. It didn't work quite as well, but I think this, like, hit a better, like, serious balance while still having some humor in it for the most part. So all this surface stuff, like you said, I thought it worked really well.
Yeah, but, like, as good as the tone is, honestly, I think that's really ends up being where this movie starts to fall short, honestly. It has such a paradoxical tone throughout the entirety of it that I think despite it being very good, it kind of dampens a lot of the impact that it could have.
Yes, and I think this is why I think the first half of the movie, not maybe the first third, where they're keeping it a lot more consistent, where everything feels like it has, like, suitable dramatic weight to me. There's a lot of good setup, but I think the actual writing of the script, they're trying to juggle too many things, keep spinning too many plates, and I think
and keep it funny for the family audiences.
Yeah, still keep it so, like, the people who want to come and see Iron Man, like, quip and, like, oh, Robert Downey Jr. is going to be wacky, like, he can't disappoint them. But I think in terms of the writing, just in the basic dramatic structure of, like, who we're supposed to, like, sympathize with and, like, what's supposed to be at stake, I think that gets really muddled. And I think especially this is more of a personal point, and since before anyone thinks that, I'm trying to, like, insert my politics into movie, this is a movie called Captain America, about, like, government regulations. Of course politics are going to be important. That said, I think the politics in this movie are super fucked up. So
It's a weird whole setup, honestly, with the politics. It's also, honestly, in hindsight, kind of weirdly downplayed in the end.
Yeah, I think that's kind of one of my big problems with the movie, is that they, I think, do a really good job, like, setting up kind of this issue about, like, holding the Avengers accountable, and, like, this like, schism between Cap and Iron Man, but then it sort of goes on its own little path when like, Bucky gets involved,
because it's about the newly son of a divorced couple.
our precious boy Bucky Barnes, and boy oh boy do I have many things to say about him, but we'll get to that. Do we want to move into our general discussion of death now?
Yeah, let's call this the spoiler point, and we'll start getting into a little bit more on who dies and whatnot, and kind of how it's handled. So with that, I really kind of actually want to start from the beginning. The first battle scene, I feel, is weirdly a good microcosm for the entire movie, and it does set up the entire movie, but I think there's a lot to it. Namely, in that it handles it starts off with this big battle between people from another movie. I don't even remember what the dude's name was. It didn't matter. What was that?
Crossbones, I think.
Yeah, Crossbones, that's his name. And it culminates in him blowing himself up. However, first, they have to fight through all his goons. And at one point, Captain yells at one of the other teammates, I don't remember which, it doesn't matter, no killing, encouraging them to not kill these individuals. Now, moments before, we had watched Falcon launch missiles out of his wingsuit directly behind people. And if that's not killing someone, I don't know what is. So basically, it sets up this weird paradox of don't kill people, but it's okay to kill people, but we're just going to gloss over it, but we're not. They focus on this idea of not killing people throughout this entire movie, all the while killing people throughout this movie, and only bringing that to attention in a few cases, and even in those rare cases, it's kind of wiped under the rug pretty quickly.
Yeah, and it's strange to me too that Cap of all people would make a fuss about like killing goons at least, because like he's a soldier. You know, soldiers kill people. That's what they do. And it feels like to me like that's an instance. Like there's no way this movie isn't a response in some way to Man of Steel, right? Like the collateral damage, like the big controversy behind that. Like Man of Steel, despite not being really celebrated, has nonetheless kind of become a big focal point for these kind of movies. So I think that was almost them, since that's sort of the way Captain America is perceived. Like he's kind of perceived as the Marvel Universe's like Superman, like, you know, the emblem of good and righteousness and all of that. So I think they wanted to like try and drive that home and like try and like differentiate it by like emphasizing like, you know, oh, no killing, where they didn't with Superman. But that's super weird because Captain America isn't Superman. He's a soldier. Captain America, like in the other movies and just like conceptually, like it makes sense for him to kill people. It doesn't make, it's not like Superman where like that's like baked into his character where he's got to be like holding back like all the time. He's so much more powerful. Like Captain America is a fucking soldier.
I do think there's an argument to be made though that, and I do see definitely where you're coming from with Captain America's approach to killing, in that he was in World War II, and if we go back and watch Cap 1, I'm sure somewhere in there someone died by an explosion. Like if you're watching in the background, you're like, oh, that guy, there's no way he walked out of that alive.
Yeah.
So I think there is an element of, yeah, Cap might have killed somebody in that, but I think the idea of him being a paragon of goodness transcends World War II into the modern world, where he's trying to embody a belief that people need to be taken in and not killed. This isn't World War II anymore. So I think there is something to be said for him not wanting to kill people, but I think the fact that they still do is the weird part.
Yeah, just a real half measure of it. That's the kind of thing that you really gotta like double down on, because I know that for the to use another example in kind of the traditional superhero movies, in The Dark Knight we get maybe a few questionable moments where like maybe like a car blows up but we don't see anyone in it, and like, oh, like, you know, that maybe could have killed someone, but they go really out of their way for the most part to show him like, you know, oh, like he drops like the Joker and like uses his grappling hook to like get him before he falls. But it's definitely, because it's not just at the beginning. I noticed throughout a lot of points in this movie, even ones where where maybe they had specified no killing, or they were fighting an enemy where it wouldn't make any sense to want to kill them, and still like their spines are getting like curved in half, and like they're getting like thrown against the wall and like blown like 1,000 feet away, or like
some of these people are gonna end up in fates worse than death.
Yeah, like I was thinking, I'm sure we'll come back to this, but in the scene where Rhodey gets paralyzed and Falcon comes to talk to Iron Man, and Iron Man just like straight up like repulsor blasts him and like blows him away. But then like the next scene he's just fine, and I think that's the weird thing. You know, forgive me for using anime speak right here, but like the power levels in this movie are strange in that injuries, I never get a good sense for what injuries might be life-threatening in the name of like having a more exciting action sequence. And that applies to both the goons that like they try to take out by the dozens, or even like versus another character, because it's not like,
see, I think that can definitely be more applied to the goons than the other characters, because I think Rhodey's the exception to this. So like I'm going to acknowledge that his spinal injury is kind of weird. It makes sense that he got it, but it also could easily be argued that the suit would have protected him from that. But I think in general, like the repulsor blast to Falcon and whatnot, it can just be written off as they're the main characters and they're superheroes. Who knows what's going on? There's an argument to be made that, oh, Falcon's armor cushioned most of the blow, or Tony only used 20% of his usual repulsor blast power.
Yeah.
So I don't know that necessarily that argument is as fitting when fighting each other, with the exception actually being Black Widow and Hawkeye, because they're just dudes.
Yeah.
So I think in that case, but we never see them actually get that hurt in the context of it. So I think it's more pertinent to look at the goons that they kick the shit out of that don't have those superpowers, and you have to assume that they're wearing standard body armor, not vibranium or unobtainium or whatever. Just something that is not going to protect them as it would the other superheroes.
Yeah. Backtracking a little bit, back to the initial fights and sort of my thoughts on how that went. The Cap no killing thing didn't jump out to me quite as much, mostly because I think, to its credit, one of the things I do like about the setup of this movie is how overall the start of this movie is very much treated like a fight in another Avengers movie. There's a lot of quips, there's a lot of fantastical acrobatics, Falcon gets to use his fun gadgets, and it just feels very much in line with some of the battles we have seen, like the first Avengers and like Ultron. But that's the thing, is that, and this is where it sticks out to me, is that the first Avengers was aliens. The second Avengers was Ultron, and they were robots. These are people. See, I actually just remembered when we were talking about Cap and like being in the future, which makes it all the weirder to me in that Loki also, that the last battle was aliens, but the goons that Loki sends out after the rest of the movie are SHIELD agents, and Cap just like straight up guns down like a group of like 10 of them and on the helicarrier when Iron Man's trying to fix it. So it's really not that much out of line, I don't think, because I think I don't remember about Ultron. Ultron would have mostly been robots, but in other movies too, like Winter Soldier, like we've seen these kind of like wacky fight scenes with human characters before. But I think what works for me about the ending of this scene, when Crossbones is going to do his little suicide bomb trick, try to take Cap with him, and Wanda like tries to get him out of the crowd, and she ends up like accidentally like blowing up that whole floor of that building. I think they handled that well, and I think it feels sort of purposeful to me, in that we're supposed to then think a little bit more about the goons who maybe have suffered these like terrible injuries. Because
it's a representation of the consequences, and it does work really well in that instance at that end of it. It's the beginning when he immediately throws out no killing and Falcon immediately does it that is just so weird to me.
Yeah. No, that is really strange, especially because like otherwise, like if they hadn't said that, like Falcon blowing with the people with the missiles, like again we've seen Cap like straight up gun people down in the present day. Wouldn't have crossed my mind for even a second. But the fact that he goes out of his way to specify it, to specify not to do it, is strange, and it feels almost like, kind of like, I don't know if you've actually seen Dawn of Justice, but in Batman vs Superman, they try to hand wave the whole Superman destroyed Metropolis thing by having Batman like lead Doomsday or Superman or whoever to like an abandoned island. It's like, oh, don't worry, like no one got killed in all these explosions. Like, oh, don't worry, like they're not killing people, they know what they're doing. Like, don't bitch at us, fans. That's what it reads as to me, kind of.
No, that one, Batman vs Superman, is one I haven't seen yet, but I think that's probably on our list coming up here on the short list, honestly.
Oh, it's got to happen sometime. You have to watch it. It's such a wonderful train wreck.
Oh, that's gonna be a rough one for me because like I have to watch. I feel like I have to watch Man of Steel first, so it's just gonna be. That's gonna be a rough week, man.
Well, we'll talk about the DCEU another time. That's a whole other bag of worms.
That's it. Oof.
Okay, did you have any other things you wanted to say about kind of that opening scene with the way the civilians are treated with Wanda? Just anything else to say about kind of the goons that get crushed?
No, honestly, I think the beginning, outside of just Cap's odd yelling, is pretty self-contained. As I said, it does work as a microcosm for the rest of the movie, because then we do start to get into the people who did die, like Charlie, the child who died in Sokovia.
I think the way that his death is treated, kind of retroactively with, that would have happened during the events of Age of Ultron. And that's kind of a thing we only get retroactively. Like, we never saw this character. We would have just been like one of the background people. And I think that the way it's handled is surprisingly effective, just because I think I've said before on a previous episode, maybe I haven't, but it's something I talk about all the time, in that I think movies maybe feel like they're cleverer than they think they are by trying to address this whole like collateral damage issue, and doing it in maybe kind of a backhanded, like, slipshod way. Like, again, with Dawn of Justice, like, Batman being like, "Don't worry, like, this part of the city is abandoned," raw, and it just reads as totally hollow.
It acknowledges that these are things that happen, and it's treated in a way that feels meaningful and with impact. It in that, like, 30-second conversation humanizes this child that we never knew before, and we get a sense of the scale on the people who died and how their actions impacted everything else. It didn't feel like they copped out with everyone was evacuated type of thing.
No, and I think what's maybe makes it work so well for me is that we don't just get that one conversation between Tony and the mother, which is very good. But then when they're talking about the Accords amongst themselves as Avengers, we get Tony going into more detail. Like, he was this kid, like, he could have done whatever he wanted with this summer. Like, he could have gone to Paris, like, could have gone out west. Nope, he chose to go, like, build housing for the poor in Sokovia. And, like, you can see that as a character, this is something that really affected Tony, like, really shook him. And it's comes across in, like, the dialogue. Robert Downey Jr.'s performance in that scene, I think, works really well, and I think it really helps hammer home that, like, this isn't just something that, because I think part of the problem for me is when movies go out of their way to acknowledge it, it's, like I said, sort of to preemptively address criticism from the audience of, like, oh, why aren't these heroes caring about the collateral damage? But this is a moment where, by incorporating it, they're really affecting the character in a way that feels natural. And I think that really feeds into Tony's kind of broader arc that he's had throughout the way he's changed and developed throughout all these movies.
Yeah.
From being, someone who is the irresponsible, like, didn't give a fuck about who his weapons were blowing up when he was a arms dealer, versus someone who's, like, feeling this, like, very deeply and, like, wants to, like, atone for not only that, but now for Ultron, and all this other stuff that has gone wrong because he keeps messing up.
But here's the weird counterpoint to this, is I think that her death, and, like, it characterizes Tony very well. Like, I'm not going to deny that to you at all. It does a very nice job of showing his growth as a character. However, the part that kind of jumped out at me in this part is that despite the fact that she has created this child and he's characterized well and we feel bad for his death, that same scene shows the destruction that the Avengers bring, and it features some people videotaping and getting crushed and whatnot, and it's supposed to have a lot more impact because you're like, see, there's more people that are dying than just this child. But I think it honestly has the opposite effect. They're kind of killed without any pomp or circumstance, which makes sense in context, but after just coming off the high that was explaining the death of Charlie and the impact that it had on this character, it feels like they're not treated with the dignity that they deserve in the movie.
I have some weird thoughts about that whole scene with kind of the videotapes, because on one hand, what sort of immediately jumped out at me is how you're right in that it felt it did feel sort of offhand, and I think partially because it felt like they were retconning, that they were trying to do retroactively, using, it felt weird that they were using the same like shots, and I think the visuals are sort of what maybe gave some cognitive dissonance to the whole scene, because we see like the Hulk jumping around and like leaving debris, and in the Avengers, like the original Avengers, like that's like the highlight of the movie. That's like the big triumphant moment. Like, Captain, I'm always angry. And then he goes off and we're rooting for him to like fuck everything up. But then we get the same like visual language, the same like setting, the same designs for the Chitauri, the same way the city looked, from the other perspective. And I think the intention was to, help make that sink in more, but I don't think it quite works, because I think it feels more like cheating at that point. I don't know, in a way that, like, the more obvious, not maybe the more obvious, but the more personal, like, conversation between Tony and this mother does, because it feels, reframing it just feels more natural to me, I guess. But I will say, what does work for me in that briefing scene, and why I think maybe, the video footage, is maybe working a little better than you think it, than from your perspective, is that I like Cap's reaction a lot, like after we see like the third clip of like Sokovia like rising up, and he's just like again in Chris Evans' voice you can hear it like very firm but still obviously pretty shaken up about it, just like that's enough, like turn it off.
See, I counter to that is I didn't get that he was shaken up about it, because it wasn't after Sokovia that he told him to turn it off. It was after Scarlet Witch blew up, or Crossbones blew himself up in Scarlet Witch's command, and he looks over at Scarlet Witch, who looks very shaken by it, and that's when he tells him to stop.
Oh, that's true. You're right.
So I think if it was after Sokovia and it was of his own volition, I think it would work better. But the other thing, you have to keep in mind that, as you've said, he is a soldier. He's used to things like this. I don't think that it would have had as much of an impact on him as it would some of the other people, like Scarlet Witch, who's clearly very rattled by this, and for good reason. She's like 19 in that or something.
Yeah, she's a teenager. No, you're totally right. I forgot they even showed. I just watched this movie yesterday. How did I forget that they showed the Crossbones thing? No, you're totally right though. Yeah, I think it would have worked. You're just correct. It would have worked a lot better if like he had done that like after Sokovia, because I think I still would have bought, despite him being a soldier. I think you can still make that argument for him like not having a problem like being trained to like do his duty and like kill an enemy, versus like like the Hulk's like the Rock's like crushed a bunch of civilians. I can see him like thinking differently about that, but since that might be an instance where it's too grounded in what the Avengers are feeling, and that, because we already kind of get that with the scene with Tony, but then it feels, because then by putting all the emphasis on Cap being concerned about Wanda, any sort of feelings we might have had for these theoretical like Charlies kind of goes out the window, because we're so focused on her, because we're so focused on what she's feeling and how Cap is reacting to that. So yeah, no, you're totally right.
It's odd, and it's not a terrible scene, and it does inform the rest of the movie. I just think that if you're watching the movie looking at how death impacts each scene, it's a little out of place.
Yeah. So. Especially because then after that, we get this in between the scene of Tony having this conversation with the mother, and then Tony going on and explaining like everything else he knew and like found out about Charlie. We get it in between, and that brings us kind of back to the more personal stuff. And like Ross's briefing feels disconnected in a way. Yeah, and in a way like I can maybe see an argument for trying to stage it that way, just because this is like kind of government bureaucracy and kind of a damage report, but that's not how it comes across. It comes across as more of like a protagonist-centered morality scene, like you said.
It's the videos, I think, in it that really kind of conflate the two, because if it was without videos and it was just like statistics, and we got like in the New York fight you killed 10,000 people indirectly or something like that, that would be one thing, and I think that would have a large impact, because it's trying to show just like the statistic of death, but it's trying to do that while also giving you a very personal touch on it, because it's all like hand cams and cell phones that are recording these gruesome deaths. Like the one lady gets crushed by rocks while very a la Cloverfield,
Yep.
while holding her camera. And so it's still trying to give these no names a personality and a presence, but it doesn't feel like it.
Right around here, maybe not right around here in terms of being lost, but the movie starts to lose me after this a little bit, because although I think that and this is tying into a few bigger things that are maybe a little tangentially involved with death, but because death is such a centerpiece of this movie's plot, I think it's sort of important to address. I think this starts to get into why the movie ultimately doesn't end up working for me, because I think that the movie does too good of a job making Iron Man look right. After you see that, or at least for me, like as an audience member, like seeing that scene where Iron Man is talking about Charlie and like kind of the passion he puts into the speech, I like cannot get behind Cap's point of view, just because it's so much more poorly articulated than Tony's, and it's
I definitely agree with you on that. I remember leaving the theater and talking with you about this movie and thinking that you can see it from Captain's point of view, and I think Captain has a legitimate point of view. It just it feels so much easier to side with Tony.
Yeah, and I think what's helped by that is that I've heard that this movie isn't trying to like make a side that's trying to like prop up a side as being more correct, and the other is just trying to show like two equally valid points of view. And I could maybe get behind that, but I think the ending calls that view into question. I think by the end, it's pretty obvious that we're supposed to be rooting for Cap, even though I think throughout the movie, Cap does a lot of questionable things, and Tony does some questionable things, but they're treated more as properly questionable. And ultimately, I think that we can't beat around the bush. This movie about someone literally garbed in like the stars and stripes called Captain America, this big, powerful, like agent of the state, this big, powerful man, acting with whatever discretion he chooses, I think is really, really quite uncomfortable given the current state of American politics. In particular, I remember thinking that walking out of this movie, like, okay, we can accept that Captain America might have a point, because we know that Captain America is going to do the right thing. We know that Captain America always has people's best interests at heart. But if you turn the same argument about having a lack of oversight to, say, like, the police, that becomes much more uncomfortable, because that gets into like vigilantism and like, oh, we want the people in charge just like do the right thing, but the reason we have these oversights is because the people in power often don't do the right thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that the movie sort of underlines this by showing by giving Cap some really, really questionable choices throughout the movie, particularly chasing after Bucky so doggedly. And we'll come back to this. There's more to talk about, because we'll kind of save this for the end.
Yeah.
But overall, like, it's sort of an idea just on its face that's hard. It's sort of hard to disagree with. Like, here are these powerful superheroes. They're accountable to nobody. Let's give them something they're accountable to. Because it would be something different if the accords that they were proposed were, like, really unreasonably, like, draconian, or, like, we saw a more specific way that they would impede Cap from doing the right thing. We never get that scene. We never get that. Everything is sort of hinged on the Bucky plot. And from that point of view, it's sort of, and in that immediate scene, it sort of turns me off right away after seeing like Tony give this really like impassioned speech for like this kid. Really like it shows like some maturity, the fact that this is Tony Stark, like the original like playboy of the Marvel universe, willing to accept responsibility and kind of let things go out of his hands, and like submit to a higher power. And then for after all that, in the face of all that, for seemingly like no reason at all, or at least that isn't well articulated in the context of the film, Cap is just like, nah, fuck that. Like, I want to do what I want.
Right. I think, as you were talking, I think this is kind of interesting as far as the plot of Civil War goes, is that you point out that it's super easy to get on Iron Man's side as far as the Civil War goes from a political side. However, in the end, you're rooting for Captain America to rescue Bucky. So it is kind of picking sides through one has a much more logical point of view and one has a much more emotional point of view, which I also think, and this is something that I'm literally spinning off the dome as we're talking.
Yeah.
It makes sense for Iron Man to have the logical point of view and Cap to be the emotional one. Cap is a soldier, but he has always been much more emotion-driven. And Tony Stark was very emotion-driven in the beginning, but has come to lean more on the logic side of things, especially given that he is, an engineer first and foremost. It does make sense for him to lean logically more than Tony, and I think that's kind of an interesting side of it. They don't really work as characters fighting on either an emotional or a political level because they're both kind of doing their own thing. So as opposed to coming at each other on a parallel field, it's more of at an angle at each other.
Yeah, I think you're really hitting on something in that perhaps in the way the movie's supposed to be constructed, that the emotional like our ties to the characters are supposed to like bring us more to Cap's side, and I think that's a great point. And I think we should come back to like the airport scene, but I think I should address this now just because it's starting to crop up quite a bit. I think where the movie completely loses me, with regards to that, is the ending, because the character where you're supposed to be feeling these emotions for is Bucky Barnes, the most boring character in the MCU. So, like down there with like the in my humble opinion, like the dark elf from like Thor 2. I thought it was a big problem.
Malachi?
Malekith, I think. We don't even know his name.
Something like that.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of the problem I have with the two most recent Captain America movies, is that the first Captain America movie did not do a good job getting me to care about Bucky. Did a good job getting me to care about like Peggy Carter, but she's not the Winter Soldier.
Yeah.
It did not do a good enough job to get me to care about Bucky, and it didn't give me any more reason to care about Bucky other than like Cap does, which in the Winter Soldier maybe might be enough. But since the other character involved in this conflict at this point is Tony Stark, like a character we've seen grow and develop over like 8 different movies, and just the way that scene of Tony's parents getting killed, the way that's shot, the way like Tony's lines are delivered, the fact that Tony's palling around with like Spider-Man. Spider-Man's really likable, and that kind of endears us to him, even if like on a script level, like Tony enlisting Spider-Man is one of his more questionable decisions.
Yeah.
Like the movie keeps giving me reasons to side with Tony. So by the time that final confrontation comes around, and Tony is like out for blood, like ready to like gut Bucky, I'm at that point, I'm in the like narrative of the fiction, I'm supposed to be on Cap's side, but even in the way that scene's presented, like Tony only like loses it so much because Cap like didn't tell him the truth. Right. So at that point, even though I know it's wrong, even though I know like logically that Bucky the Winter Soldier like didn't like it wasn't his fault, he didn't do all these things wrong, I just can't bring myself enough to care about him as a person. And at that point, I'm like, all right, Iron Man, like, I don't care. He killed my mom. Like, yeah, you get him. Like, fuck him up, Tony. And that's totally the wrong reaction, but that's the one that the movie ends up sort of leading me to, just, I think, from the imbalance of, part of it's a logic thing. Part of it's, again, that I think the logic on Tony's side is so strong until that moment. But by that moment, I had been so on his side
Right.
that it's, I think the final reaction is not what it wants. The point where I thought the ending of the movie, and this gets into maybe a separate issue about the MCU, about whether or not the stakes are high enough with regards to like character deaths. But by the end of the movie,
that's a whole nother discussion we need to have at some point, because I have lots of thoughts on that one.
Yes, we can maybe come back around to that, because I think
no, that's gonna end up being like its own episode, because that's one that we can argue about for a solid hour by ourselves.
Oh, it's true. Yeah, man, future Marvel movie perhaps. Or talking about a previous one, but basically, I think that if we're talking about who didn't die, but who should have died, I left that movie thinking that I wanted Iron Man to kill Bucky Barnes, and that was not the correct thing the movie should have been making me feel.
See, as you're saying this, I don't have strong feelings on Bucky Barnes either way. I don't care if he lives or dies, per se. I think for the movie to work, it made sense that he had to live, but coming at it from your perspective of someone who does not give a hot shit about him, and clearly in this sense prefers Iron Man, and it makes sense why Iron Man would want to kill Bucky, I can definitely understand your desire to see him die, and I do think that would present a very interesting situation for the two of them to resolve, and I think that could have been written into a very good ending, potentially. I don't necessarily agree that he should have died, but I think it would have been an interesting take to see what would have happened had he died.
Well, let me, if you'll allow me a quick indulgence, to present sort of my little fan fiction ending here for how I think it could have gone down and still been appropriate to like the themes and emotions of the movie. Because the biggest problem with that, in terms of like, part of this again is that I think like Bucky is such a boring character, and it drives me nuts that otherwise.
Yeah, wait a second. You will get your moment, but it would fit thematically perfectly as you're saying this. It would have been the perfect showing that their actions have consequences. Holy shit.
Yes, exactly.
It would have been absolutely perfect. Oh my god. Because all of this is about showing that everything that they've done, every fight has had a death toll involved. This would have been, oh my god, you've just shocked my fucking mind. Oh my god.
So here's what I propose for this ending, right? And again, acknowledging that part of this is that I think like Bucky's a boring character, and I think that his presence is actively harming the Captain America movies. Because like I like Captain America, I like Chris Evans's portrayal, I like the way they wrote the character in the past. I like Captain America, and it frustrates me that so much of it is dedicated to like Captain America at this point like feels like a shitty love interest, like who is like written only in response. Like his one track mind is like all about Bucky. Drives me nuts. Get him out of here. So what I propose is that in that final fight, and this would be pretty bold of Marvel to do, because it would mean that Iron Man is basically a murderer, which I don't think would be super out of character for him at this point, like especially given how like heated things go.
Yeah.
Iron Man kills Bucky, and then we get that last scene that's supposed to be like a really, you can tell from the way they shot it, of like Iron Man, Cap like plunging his shield to break like the like pseudo like arc reactor, like Iron Man's chest piece.
Yeah.
And it rings a sort of hollow to me, just because the stakes feel so low. Like, oh, like Bucky got his metal arm torn off. Like, darn, he's gonna have to get a new one.
Right.
And I think like, if Iron Man had actually done it, if he had actually killed Bucky, and then Cap like given every reason in the world, like still held back, like still only like disabled him, and still only like let him live, and like was the bigger man, it would then I think give a lot more weight to this idea that like, yes, we should trust Captain America. Like he's able to make these calls, like Tony Stark like cannot. Like you know, the emotions are like too swept up, and then it gives more weight to that. Like there's more of a loss of life, and then like the schism between them feels a lot more legitimate at the end.
Right.
Whereas like in the actual version of the ending, Cap basically just like gives him a phone and is like, "Yo, man, like I'm sorry, like we cool."
And I honestly don't know that necessarily that ending would need to be changed, like the giving of the phone, because it makes sense because Cap would still see the higher duty, what needs to be done.
Yeah.
If this comes up again, I will still be in exile, but I will be there to help because this is what I do. This is my job. It would have made sense. And I mean, even if Marvel didn't necessarily want to have Iron Man kill Bucky, there's still ways to have it incidentally be his fault accidentally.
Yeah, like if you don't want to go that far, because that's and I mean I think it would be an interesting move just because, you know, taking who has essentially been like the face of your franchise up until this point, like been in the most movies, been like Iron Man 1 was like the start of this whole thing.
Yeah.
And like giving him that really like dark character choice, I think would be something interesting to wrestle with. But it also the fact that death is so permanent that like even if, you know, we Iron Man and Captain America like have to team up when, like, you know, Thanos like rolls around in Infinity War, but like that's still like hanging over them.
Yeah.
And like Iron Man like gets, you know, maybe cleared of it because, like, you know, Bucky was in the eyes of like the law still like guilty, and just that whole, I think it could have created a lot of interesting situations. It would have just required them to go for it that I don't know if the MCU is willing to do.
See, and here's the thing with that. And like I'm kind of thinking about it, I was trying to come up with like a good counter argument of like, oh, but it's still you know, it's an entertainment movie. It's for families. You can't just have somebody outright kill him and then have him be the face of the MCU continuing on. But that's pretty much what they already have. Aside from actually killing Bucky, he went as so far, the intent was there. The intent to kill was there.
Yeah, Iron Man, if given the chance, Iron Man would have gunned him down. Like, not like if it was within his power, if he had a higher power level, that would have been the end result.
Right. So I don't know that necessarily even having him pull that trigger on that, I don't think would have been that different from how they already have it set up.
Yeah, I guess part of it, since it's a movie, I think part of it is just a matter of optics and like the fact that death is so final and just the way it looks to an audience. Like, people will forget, you know, we got like Spider-Man Homecoming, Iron Man's in that movie. It's coming out in like a month or whatever, as of this speaking. And like, you know, Iron Man's in that, and like, you know, no one's thinking about how he almost murdered, you know, Bucky Barnes, or tried to murder Bucky Barnes at the end of Civil War. If he did actually murder Bucky Barnes, since death is so final, that would stick with people a lot more. And I think that would make even though the impact on people's minds is just in terms of like basically visuals, like the act of seeing him doing it versus the act of like him wanting to murder him on a writing level. I think the fact that seeing Iron Man kill an important character would have maybe had a concrete effect on like seeing him like joke and pal around with Spider-Man, like in the new Spider-Man trailer, and make that a little harder for people to accept. Yeah, I think that would have been an interesting decision.
Yeah, I think you're right in that. I think I definitely see where you're coming from, and I think thematically it would have been really good. But as much as I tried to refute my own thought, you kind of handed it to me with it. It would have been hard for the general audiences to accept. And I mean, it's what this movie's aimed for. Marvel is a general audience movie. It's not the DCU, you know, the thinking man's universe. It's for the family.
Yeah, and I'm sort of a little torn on that question. I think it's an interesting question about whether the impact on that impact on the universe, again, I think it's a super interesting decision. But would it have been like, you know, I love Iron Man. Like, Iron Man's one of my favorite superheroes. I love this version of Tony Stark.
Yeah.
Like, do I want to see it? Like, speaking as someone who like enjoys going to the movies and like seeing him quip and do all this stuff, like, would I want that knowledge that he's like a murderer like hanging in the back of my mind? I don't know. I just think it would have made this particular movie land with a little bit more weight to me, and maybe I think there are other sort of problems I had with the way the conflict is presented that would have that this wouldn't have solved. It might have felt like too little too late because it all happens at the end. I think we would need maybe a bit more balance throughout, but I think that would have done a much better job on getting me on Cap's side at the end and convincing me that he had an argument as opposed to how it is right now, and that the entirety of his argument pretty much hinges on like you caring about Bucky, which I don't. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think presenting it would have been a very different movie had it ended that way, and I think thematically it would have worked really well, but I think that would just be a dark cloud on the MCU that I don't know how they could really clear that up.
yeah, it really is like you said a very DC move, and there's like evidence to support that I won't go into because that's kind of spoilers for other movies, but it's definitely more in line with like that kind of thinking. And I'm not entirely against the darker tone in principle. Like, I like the fun of the Marvel movies, but I don't know, I enjoy both sides of it. So yeah, that sort of leave that at that. I think it would have had profound implications on the rest of the MCU, but I think this would have been a more interesting movie if Iron Man had killed Bucky. Anything else you wanted to talk about?
I honestly think that Bucky, our conversation here on Bucky covered everything I could have wanted to say and more, from just a theme standpoint, from how it was handled within the movie. It really it covered all the bases in just Bucky's ability to live.
Yeah, because that's sort of the thing about this movie that I think is sort of weird about it, and that it kind of does all come back to him in, the movie's called like Captain America Civil War, and you think it's about, it seems to be set up more like an Avengers movie, and in that sense, like, it really does zero in on like those Cap elements. I just think and again, like, it sort of pains, it almost like pains me to say it, that I think this is the best route for the movie to take, and partly because it like makes me look like a total sociopath, like I want to see like Cap's best friend get like fucked up, but it's also generally sad to me because I don't think because I think there is a version of this movie where the intent worked a lot better, where like you genuinely care about Bucky, and like you get to that final scene, and like a lot of people I remember saying were like really like heartbroken by that final fight, but like again, I was just so in Iron Man's corner that I wasn't feeling it, and I wanted to feel it. Like, I wanted to be where everyone else was, but the problem was that after like 3 movies, they just didn't do like the legwork of getting me there on him, I don't think.
I agree, and I see where you're coming from. I don't have the same disdain for Bucky that you do. I don't disagree that he is essentially the MacGuffin of Winter Soldier. He has the personality of a brick in this movie, but after this discussion, I think that his death would be very interesting and thematically fitting and a very good touch to the movie, but I still don't necessarily agree that he deserved to die.
Yeah, deserves is a bit of a harsh word, like just on like a writing level. Like he's like a victim, like he's been brainwashed by like Hydra. But in terms of, like, I remember like the post-credit scene, like I was really terrified when they like put him under in like Wakanda. I'm like, oh no, motherfucker, like Black Panther better not be about Bucky. Like it better not be about him again. Like he better not be MacGuffining up this other movie. And I think that's maybe a good like ellipsis to like leave off on, because that's sort of a continuing question, like how will he be used if if they plan on bringing him back or not, or when, because if he just, like, goes into the ice in Wakanda and they just, like, forget about him, then, well, you know, they weren't using him anyway.
Right. I mean, I think that is kind of the interesting question of this, is that where we are right now is we are seeing an incomplete MCU. So we don't know where it's going yet.
Yeah, we'll see. Oh God, like my worst nightmare. Like I wake up in a cold sweat, like thinking about that, like Bucky was like the Infinity Stone, that the last one that Thanos needed all along, and he's like the most important MacGuffin in Infinity War. Like that's what I have nightmares about.
Yeah, that'd be not so great. I could do without that.
Oh, great. Well,
but yeah, I mean that's all I got. Any final notes from you?
Yeah, this is one of the instances thinking about this movie, because I think I came out of it strangely, despite this conversation, reinforced by a lot of my thoughts, because I remember like thinking as I walked out of the theater that like they needed to have more direct stakes, higher stakes, like someone needed to die in that last fight, and like I still feel like that. I still think that would have given the movie a little bit more oomph, but I think being reminded of that last scene and how we haven't seen this group of the Avengers, like these characters, we haven't seen them for a little while, and we won't again until Infinity War and maybe Black Panther. We don't know how it's going to go yet, and I think actually talking about it has made me a little more excited to see kind of what the future holds, because watching Civil War again at least reminded me that they do a good job writing their characters. They do a good job giving you fun characters that you want to follow, and like a reasonably good job of developing them across these movies. So if nothing else, even if this movie didn't have the bite that I think it maybe needed, it still left me interested to see what they're going to do next.
No, absolutely. And that feels like as good a place as any to say, I'm Sean McKinda. You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda. You can find me on Twitch as well at Helpless_Skippy. I stream anything every Wednesday from about 8 to 10.
And I'm Jackson Keller. You can find me on Twitter at JacksonJKeller, where I talk a lot about superhero movies, usually bitching about them.
You can also find the podcast on Twitter at BADH_cast. We'd also like to thank Lords of the Highway for the use of their song Suicide Alternative Take. It's our theme song. You can find it on the album High Octane, Low Expectations. It's a really good album. I highly recommend it. And with that, we would like to remind you what Captain says.
Fuck, stop! You're gonna kill someone. Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go